It is Sunday. In the past, when I did radio programs, often I would use for content material from around the world that was related to my views as a humanist or as a thinker, and even on LA radio, I was known as long-winded. I was doing long form while everybody else was chopping things up and we were headed toward memes. And I stuck it out because I have a voice for it, and so I'm going to do that this morning. We were talking in the last live stream. I was saying, quite frankly, that I consider myself an Asian first, always have, but that I am an American, and that my viewpoint of coming to Asia is different. Thus, I pocket my Americanism because I don't want to Americanize Asia, that's for sure. And I bring back as much of who I remember of myself as a Tamil person, because Tamil people, as I've shown in the videos here, you can see last year I filmed in Mahabalipuram, near my birthplace, and talked about the seagoing voyages directly to Cambodia. And Suryavarman the First, the king who begins the Angkor Wat project, is a Tamil person. So Tamil culture is coming into its own, along with India and its new economy and booming times. And so I'm not really a part of that because I left and I'm an American, so I'm outside of that. But I can function in the role of a translator to the extent that I find my level. And one of the things is to be very clear about who I am. I am American, and that's clear to everyone. But what's not so clear is that that's just a part of who I am, and I perceive of American policy and have for 40 years as a resistor and an opposer to war and a pacifist, and I've basically been a loser on the losing side of over and over again, but maintained the strict posture of my upbringing. Which brings us to Ian Buruma, who I believe I have interviewed on the air in Los Angeles at, I'm gonna say it, haven't said it in a long time, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 in Santa Barbara. I think I did in fact have Mr. Buruma on a program. Wait, where's that? My voice is all over because I'm singing the Thai language here in Bangkok. But take a deep breath. It is time for a very long read. So I'm me, and I'm going to read about the American policy toward Japan, which, after World War II, which involves a kind of viewpoint or a posture. One is from that side when I'm over there in California, and the other is from this side when I'm in Asia. So a great way to begin would be to read an article like this, because this frames everything. I'm going to use my voice to read in English, and as you can hear lately, a little bit of Texan English is in there. There's like something going on in American English. A piece about our policy, right? USA policy, by Ian Buruma, whom I respect. And it uses a 900-page book about the subject by Gary J. Bass. The book is titled Judgment at Tokyo, World War II on Trial, and the Making of Modern Asia. So the Tokyo trial, the Allied Tribunal after the war in Tokyo, the verdicts. In Europe you have Nuremberg going on, and this is the Asia side, and USA is trying to just make this the way they just made that, in a grandiose, what can only be called a grandiose global land shuffle, within which all things were decided. We'll just stick, we're going to have an Israel here, I have now traveled to many of these places and have considered them just as a person like you or me, and that was a very interesting time, the post-war period. So this focuses on, very specifically, the Allied Tribunal, the verdict against the Japanese for war crimes. Okay? By Ian Buruma, the verdict. In Nuremberg, in the fall of 1945, 22 high-ranking Nazis were put on trial before a group of judges from allied nations. A year later, 12 of the defendants were sentenced to be hanged, and 7 received prison sentences. Few people, even in Germany, felt particularly sorry for the condemned men who had caused so much death and destruction all over Europe, but there were reservations about a trial in which the victors prosecuted the vanquished. Winston Churchill, for one, would have preferred to shoot the Nazi leaders and be done with it. Stalin thought that killing 50,000 Germans might do. Even Churchill was a little put out by that. Instead, the London Charter was created to try the top Nazis for crimes against humanity, a new concept, and crimes against peace, another new idea, along with conventional war crimes. Crimes against humanity meant murder, extermination, enslavement, and other such acts against a civilian population, or persecution on religious or racial grounds. That's crimes against humanity. Planning and waging a war of aggression counted as crimes against peace. The aim in creating these laws was to set norms for the future. But critics of the Nuremberg proceedings quickly objected to the use of retroactive justice, punishment by laws that had not existed when the crimes were committed. They also noted that before Nuremberg, political leaders had not been held personally responsible for acts of state, however cruel and aggressive they may have been. Hypocrisy was another issue raised by critics. German leaders were accused of killing large numbers of defenseless civilians, but what about the eradication of entire cities by Allied bombing? And how was one of Stalin's hanging judges who presided over some of the bloodiest Soviet show trials entitled to try Germans for crimes against humanity? If the Nuremberg trial was questionable in some respects, the trial of Japanese wartime leaders in Tokyo, which resulted in 7 men hanged, 16 imprisoned, was far more dubious. John Dower, the finest American historian of modern Japan, called the Tokyo trial, quote, a murky reflection of its German counterpart, close quote. On a visit to Japan in 1946, the eminent U.S. diplomat George Kennan dismissed the proceedings as, quote, political trials, close quote. Charles Willoughby, General Douglas MacArthur's intelligence chief in Tokyo, thought the proceedings were, quote, the worst hypocrisy in recorded history, close quote. And Radha Binod Pal, the trial's Indian judge, didn't think that any of the defendants should be found guilty because he viewed a trial conducted mostly by representatives of a colonial power or of colonial powers as illegitimate. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, as the Tokyo trial was officially called, lasted longer than the trial in Nuremberg. It stretched from May of 1946 to November of 1948 and was on a far grander scale. So that's 2.5 years, 46 to 48. Where the Nuremberg judges came from 4 countries, the Tokyo judges came from 11. The United States, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, China, the Philippines, the Netherlands, France, New Zealand, India, and the Soviet Union. These were the 11 countries that the judges of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East came from. United States, Canada, Australia, the UK, China, the Philippines, the Netherlands, France, New Zealand, India, and the Soviet Union. Wow. Philippines and New Zealand are interesting for the numbers of people they have, I suppose, and there is some colonial stuff here going on, but Portugal is not there. So these judges came from 11 countries. The Tokyo trial was also more of an American affair than the tribunal in Germany had been. Japan was under Allied occupation until 1952, but control was almost entirely in the hands of General MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, SCAP. And if the ferocious Allied destruction of German cities was a point to be skirted in Nuremberg, the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not to mention the incendiary bombing of many other Japanese cities, cast even greater doubt on the legitimacy of Allied judgment of Japanese war crimes. Illegitimate or not, as Gary J. Bass points out in his exhaustive and fascinating book, Judgment at Tokyo, World War II on Trial and the Making of Modern Asia, published by Knopf, the Tokyo trial had serious consequences that continue to play out to this day. Placing the trial firmly in the context of colonialism, racial attitudes, the Cold War, and post-colonial Asian politics, Bass argues quite rightly that the trial, quote, reveals some of the reasons why a liberal international order has not emerged in Asia, close quote. I'm going to read that graph again because it's kind of dense. What he's describing, how Gary J. Bass places point of view in his book, this 900-page book, Judgment at Tokyo, World War II on Trial and the Making of Modern Asia. And he says, placing the trial firmly in the context of colonialism, racial attitudes, the Cold War, and post-colonial Asian politics, Bass argues quite rightly that the trial, quote, reveals some of the reasons why a liberal international order has not emerged in Asia, close quote. It is impossible to imagine a mainstream German politician openly disparaging the Nuremberg trial as mere foreign propaganda, or paying tribute to convicted war criminals in a place of worship. Yet several Japanese prime ministers have done just that with regard to the Tokyo trial. The late Shinzo Abe, for example, prayed at the imperialist Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, where major war criminals are glorified and monuments set among elegant gardens honor such notorious wartime organizations as the Genpeitai, the rough Japanese equivalent of the Gestapo. One reason Abe and some of his predecessors have done so, provoking Japanese liberals as much as other Asians, is their desire to overturn what right-wing nationalists like to call the, quote, Tokyo trial version of history, close quote. They believe that Allied propagandists and the Japanese leftists who parroted them imposed a masochistic view of the past on Japan and unfairly accused the country of waging an aggressive war and committing worse atrocities than other nations. The version of history offered by the Tokyo trial was a little skewed. The proceedings followed the example of Nuremberg, as though the war waged by Japan had been an Asian mirror image of that waged by Germany. Indeed, many Westerners at the time thought that the Japanese were even worse than the Nazis. Racial prejudice had something to do with this belief. Bass quotes an Australian newspaper, quote, "The Jap has not a soul to think in terms of decency," close quote. But the attack on Pearl Harbor also contributed, as did the treatment of Western prisoners of war, which was more severe than the usual German handling of POWs, as long as they weren't Soviet soldiers. Bass quotes some startling statistics. In 1944, a third of Americans wanted Japan to be, quote, destroyed as a political entity, close quote. 13% thought all Japanese people should be killed. That was in 1944, according to Gary J. Bass in his massive book about it, and being represented here by Ian Buruma. In 1944, 13% of Americans thought all Japanese people should be killed. These were just the views of ordinary Americans responding to opinion polls. Henry L. Stimson, the wartime U.S. War Secretary, who had blocked Jewish refugees from coming to the United States as late as 1944, and who, after the war, saw no reason to prosecute the Nazis for what they had done inside Germany, was appalled by the horrible pictures of the way the Japanese are treating our poor Air Force boys when they get hold of them, close quote. Close quote. These boys, of course, had been killing hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians from the air. General MacArthur, meanwhile, wanted the Tokyo trial to deal only with Pearl Harbor and not with Japan's far greater war crimes committed against other Asians, especially the Chinese. The Japanese war was, in fact, not the same as Hitler's war, nor were the defendants in the Tokyo trial much like the Nazis in the dock at Nuremberg. There was no Japanese equivalent of the Nazi Party and no dictator like Hitler. Koki Hirota, who was sentenced to death by hanging, Shigenori Togo, 20 years in prison, and Mamoru Shigemitsu, 7 years, were neither fanatics nor thugs, but civilian politicians who served in a number of governments that were more and more dominated by military men. All three, Hirota as prime minister and foreign minister, Togo and Shigemitsu as foreign ministers, had tried at different times to stop the militarists from going to war. They failed. But the prosecutor's allegation that these men were a part of a conspiracy to wage a war of aggression was never plausible. There were too many disagreements inside various Japanese cabinets for that. Conspiracy to commit a crime, in any case, wasn't a Japanese judicial concept. It was a peculiarly Anglo-American one. Conspiracy to commit a crime wasn't a Japanese judicial concept. It was a peculiarly Anglo-American one. Many of the military leaders on trial were belligerent. General Hideki Tojo, hanged, certainly was, and they were unable or unwilling to stop their troops from raping and murdering countless civilians. Tojo also ordered POWs to do hard labor, which often killed them. Torture, especially at the hands of the dreaded Kempeitai, whose leaders, oddly enough, were not tried in Tokyo, was routinely practiced all over the Japanese Empire. But the defendants in Tokyo had not been driven by a genocidal ideology. Many of them may have been warmongers, but they weren't Nazis. As latecomers to the imperialist game, the Japanese had been fighting wars on the Asian continent since 1894. They colonized Korea, Taiwan, and islands in the South Pacific, conquered Manchuria, now northeast China, in 1931, and set it up as a puppet state, and invaded the rest of China in 1937. Much of this was done in the spirit of defensive jingoism. Japan wanted to protect what it saw as its legitimate interests in Asia by building its own empire, one that both opposed Western empires in the region and mimicked them. This Japanese enterprise was often vicious, frequently dishonest, and ultimately disastrous, but it was essentially an imperialist war. Oh, sorry, folks. These bloody ads. See, when you're live, you can't cut, which is a drag. We may just do a... Can we pause the stream? No, I want to see if we can just go live, This thing is long. I'll pick up the idea here that he's talking about, which is heavy. This is the beginning of, there's an ad right in the center of this thing. It's so annoying. This is the beginning of Professor Buruma, Ian Buruma here, talking about the Japanese now during the war as a separate and distinct thing from trying them as you would the people in Nuremberg. And so this is a POV, a point of view that's being presented here about, people who think of the post-Tokyo trial as one kind of Asia, and people who were there then, what they were doing, the decisions they were making, and so on. I'm having difficulty because there's an ad in the center of the thing, but I've picked it up now, I believe. So he's talking about how Japanese atrocities were not necessarily ideologically driven like the Nazis, okay? So he says, as latecomers to the imperialist game, the Japanese had been fighting wars on the Asian continent since 1894. They colonized Korea, Taiwan, and islands in the South Pacific, conquered Manchuria, now northeast China, in 1931, and set it up as a puppet state, and invaded the rest of China in 1937. So that's 45 years of straight war on the continent. Much of this was done in the spirit of defensive jingoism. Japan wanted to protect what it saw as its legitimate interests in Asia by building its own empire, one that both opposed Western empires in the region and mimicked them. This Japanese enterprise was often vicious, frequently dishonest, and ultimately disastrous. But it was essentially an imperialist war. It did not include a systematic and ideological program of extermination. Still, Bass is right to keep returning to the question of race. Tojo, who served as Japan's prime minister from 1941 to 1944, believed that his country needed to liberate Asians from Western imperialism and spread its, quote, superior culture, quote, all over the world, close quote. It was a brutal liberation that most Asians didn't much appreciate. But the Japanese leaders, Tojo among them, defended their mission by claiming to be fighting against white supremacy. In 1919, the Japanese demand for racial equality in the Covenant of the League of Nations had been denied. In 1919, the demand by the Japanese for racial equality in the Covenant of the League of Nations, that's Wilson's project, had been denied. Some 2 decades later, Japan, in the view of Tojo and the others, was forced into a war with the West. The invasion of China was harder to justify because Western imperial powers had conspired against Japanese interests, cutting the country off from oil and other vital supplies. At the same time, the president of Japan's Privy Council warned the militarists against a war with the West, lest such a venture unite the Europeans and the Americans in a common, quote, hatred of the yellow race, close quote. Some anti-colonial Asian leaders in the 1940s, including Jose Laurel in the Philippines and Sukarno in the Dutch East Indies, were prepared to view the Japanese as liberators and hoped that collaboration with Japan would rid them of their Western masters. Here we're talking about the Dutch, my friends, and others. Again, read Multatuli, please. Max Havelaar, the single novel from Multatuli, the Dutch author. I encourage everyone to read it on the planet. If we're talking about the idea of Sukarno being cool with the Japanese as liberators and hoping that collaboration with Japan would rid them of their Western masters. It did in the end, but not before Asians suffered a great many horrors at Japanese hands. 2 of the 3 Asian judges on the Tokyo Tribunal, Delphine Jarania from the Philippines, and Mei Ruao from China were, Bass points out, harsher on the Japanese than the Western judges were. That shouldn't have been surprising, since Mei had suffered from Japanese bombing in Chongqing, the last wartime Chinese capital, and Jarania had been in the Bataan Death March in 1942, which claimed the lives of as many as 18,000 Filipinos. Justice Pal, on the other hand, the Indian Justice Pal, an eloquent Bengali intellectual who had become a respected lawyer under the British Raj, agreed with Tojo and his colleagues in the dock in finding the idea of a Japanese conspiracy, quote, preposterous. Paul claimed that his fellow judges from the West had a, quote, bias created by racial or political factors, close quote. Japan had been right to feel threatened in the 1930s, he thought, quote, with nationalist China, Soviet Russia, and the race-conscious English-speaking peoples of the Pacific closing in on her, close quote. That's Paul. And if Japanese education and propaganda had been a little racist too, well, quote, I cannot condemn those of the Japanese leaders who might have thought of protecting their race by inculcating their racial superiority in the youthful mind, close quote. No wonder, then, that Justice Powell should have a monument all to himself at Yasukuni Shrine, bearing the words, quote, when time shall have softened passion and prejudice, when reason shall have stripped the mask from misrepresentation, then justice, holding evenly her scales, will require much of past censure and praise to change places, close quote. Few of the Japanese nationalists who go to the shrine to pay their respects to the Indian judge will recognize that these words were spoken originally by Jefferson Davis, the Confederate leader who mourned the lost cause of slavery. Are the Japanese nationalists right? Was the Tokyo trial just a hypocritical piece of Western propaganda taken up by Japanese leftists? The truth is far more complicated. Western bias can safely be assumed since the trial was decided upon by the U.S. and dominated by judges from the British Empire. The chief judge was an Australian, the chief prosecutor an American, and aside from Jarania, May, and Pal, the judges representing Asian peoples were Dutch, British, and French. The Koreans, who had suffered from Japanese aggression longer than any other people, had no judge at all. Nor is it a stretch to think that a sense of wounded imperialism might have colored the perspective of some of the European judges. Although Bass overstates the case when he says that Britain's post-war Labour government, quote, embraced imperialism, the Labour government embraced imperialism, Bass charges, close quote. The independence of India and Burma, at least, had its approval. There's no doubt that the Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, and the Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, still held an exalted view of British power in the world, which they sought to preserve through the Commonwealth and through a global network of military bases. The Japanese invasions of European colonies were clearly experienced as a humiliation. Publicly abasing Western POWs had been a deliberate Japanese tactic to show other Asians how low the white man could be brought down and to promote the mission of restoring Asia to Asians. The legacy of the tribunal was certainly muddled by the lack of consensus among the judges about the legitimacy of the charges. So that's an interesting passage there. He's talking about the European judges kind of, yes, they're taking responsibility for colonialism, but not really. They're also still trying to be, on top. This is an interesting collection of judges. The legacy of the tribunal was certainly muddled by the lack of consensus among the judges about the legitimacy of the charges. Justice Powell was not the only one to challenge the idea of conspiracy to wage war. The charge of crimes against peace had been justified in Nuremberg by various pre-war agreements to proscribe war, such as the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. In the wake of the First World War, the French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand suggested a Franco-U.S. agreement to outlaw war between the two nations. When his U.S. counterpart, Frank B. Kellogg, showed little interest in a bilateral arrangement, the idea was expanded to include most of the countries in the world, including Japan, close quote. That's the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. But international agreements are not criminal laws. Even the Australian jurist William Webb, the tribunal's chief judge, admitted that, quote, international law, unlike the laws of many countries, does not expressly include a crime of naked conspiracy, close quote, and that the creation of this crime was, quote, nothing short of judicial legislation, close quote. Right, so who's the body here? Natural law based on religious and legal philosophies associated with such figures as the 17th century Dutch statesman and jurist Hugo Grotius, and systematized earlier by Thomas Aquinas, was also invoked to condemn the Japanese. The Dutch judge Bert Reuling was among those who dissented from the tribunal's rulings. The Dutch judge, Bert Reuling, was among those who dissented from the tribunal's rulings, much to the alarm of his government in The Hague, and he pointedly took issue with the effort to enlist natural law. Fully conscious of the Dutch colonial record in Asia, he wrote, quote, I hesitate to approach the Far East in our effort to determine the criminality of aggression, with quotations from idealists and philosophers of the very period when our heroes and soldiers were conquering its territories in what could hardly be called a defensive war, close quote. Reuling wanted to limit the trial to conventional war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's my first cough at the half-hour mark. We are reading The Verdict by Ian Buruma. I'm live, MTK on the MIC, in Bangkok. Trying to get this done before the sun gets too hot on a Sunday morning in November. We've just gotten to a rather nice statement, revealing statement by a Dutch judge on this tribunal who realized the hypocrisy of it and said, I hesitate to approach the Far East in our effort to determine the criminality of aggression, with quotations from idealists and philosophers of the very period when our heroes and soldiers were conquering its territories in what could hardly be called a defensive war, close quote. That's as close to a post-colonial comment as you can get. Bert Reuling. And Reuling wanted to limit the trial to conventional war crimes and crimes against humanity. Meanwhile, Joseph Keenan, the American chief prosecutor, was prone to sonorous absurdities. He claimed that the Japanese aggressors had invaded countries in Asia intending to, quote, destroy democracy and its essential basis, freedom and the respect of human personality, close quote. These countries in Asia were, of course, European and U.S. colonies. That Keenan was often drunk is no excuse. Even Asians who had loathed their Japanese oppressors would have been astonished by this delusional flourish of American idealism. The Asian judges, apart from Powell, had no doubts about the court's jurisdiction. Bass is especially good on May, the Chinese judge, to whom too little attention has been paid in other books on the Tokyo trial. A man of considerable learning who had studied at Stanford University, May was perhaps the least cynical of the judges. He truly believed that the trial would create a more peaceful and democratic world order, and had the thankless task of promoting this idea even as his nationalist government was being quickly overwhelmed by Mao Zedong's communist revolutionaries. He also did his best to focus attention on Japanese atrocities in China. If MacArthur thought the attack on Pearl Harbor was a murderous war crime, Chinese claims were far more persuasive. As many as 20 million Chinese died in the war between 1937 and 1945. 20 million Chinese. died in the war between 1937 and 1945. The retreating Japanese had destroyed most of the documents attesting to their actions, but there was nonetheless sufficient evidence to shock Japanese public opinion. Various witnesses gave accounts of what they saw when the nationalist capital Nanjing was ransacked in the course of 6 weeks in 1937 by Japanese Imperial Army troops, who raped countless women and killed tens of thousands and possibly even hundreds of thousands of people. A Japanese army document produced at the trial showed that superior officers had either encouraged or ignored these crimes. Quote, "In the battlefield, we think nothing of rape," close quote, one soldier said. Chinese POWs were lined up and, quote, "killed to test the efficiency of the machine gun," close quote, another recalled. The Japanese press reported these horrors at length, but May's noble intention to establish a thorough historical record of Japan's crimes was further hampered by the Civil War in China. The nationalist Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek tended to see trials against Japanese war criminals as a distraction from his struggle against the communists. Chiang Kai-shek even employed one of the most ruthless Japanese generals as his military advisor. The massacres perpetrated by this particular general had been directed mostly at communist guerrillas, which didn't especially concern Chiang Kai-shek. The communists, in turn, didn't bother much about the Nanjing massacre until decades later because its victims were governed by the nationalists. Other Japanese crimes were ignored at the Tokyo trial for equally cynical reasons. Japanese doctors and scientists in the notorious Unit 731, which was in charge of biological and chemical warfare, had conducted hideous experiments on Chinese and Russian prisoners and deliberately infected large numbers of Chinese with fatal diseases, such as bubonic plague, just to see what would happen. The leader of this unit, Shiro Ishii, and his team received immunity from the Americans in exchange for their data, which were thought to be useful. Quite how useful the data proved has never been divulged. Nor was attention paid at the Tokyo trial to the organized effort of the Japanese Imperial Army to force Chinese, Korean, and other Asian women into sexual slavery. The wide-scale rape of local women had become a headache for the army since it provoked greater anti-Japanese resistance. To mitigate this problem, so-called comfort women were tricked or kidnapped and made to serve as Japanese soldiers. But their suffering wasn't on anyone's agenda in 1946. Their suffering wasn't on anyone's agenda in 1946. This enormity would become a serious issue only much later. The extent to which the defendants in the Tokyo trial were personally responsible for the crimes in China or in other parts of Asia was hard to prove. So they were convicted for their failure to stop those crimes. But in the end, it wasn't the Western powers that came down hardest on the Japanese. Justice May thought the final judgment had been too soft in some respects. The Chinese communists were outraged that Tojo and other defendants had been allowed to make self-justifying speeches in court and to be defended by able U.S. lawyers. The People's Daily, that's China of course, thundered, quote, "MacArthur's protection and indulgence is the real reason why war criminals such as Tojo dare to be so arrogant," close quote. In one important respect, the Tokyo trial version of history was indeed utterly remiss. Emperor Hirohito, whose name was on many incriminating documents, was, for political reasons, neither prosecuted nor even called as a witness. When Tojo inadvertently let it slip that, quote, "no Japanese subject would go against the will of His Majesty," close quote, he was swiftly reminded not to implicate the emperor and stated that the emperor had never had anything but peaceful intentions. MacArthur, as well as his advisors, decided in 1945 that if the emperor did not remain on his throne, there would be a nationwide revolt that would upset the SCAP's administration, Strategic Commands Administration. Only a few days after the formal Japanese surrender, as Bass writes, quote, both the American occupiers and the Japanese authorities converged on a common line. The imperial court, so useful for a peaceful occupation, was not to be blamed for the war, close quote. Bass might have stressed, however, that this was the view of MacArthur's most conservative advisors and the most reactionary Japanese authorities, and that many Japanese, including some of Hirohito's closest relatives, thought he should at least abdicate. It was the Americans who quashed that idea from the beginning. Bass describes some of the rifts in the U.S. administration, in Tokyo as well as in Washington, D.C. At almost 900 pages, his book is already very long, quote, necessarily so, close quote, in his opinion. But on the politics swirling around that's General MacArthur's court, he could have said more. There were new dealers in his entourage who wanted a more radical transformation of Japan than did more conservative figures such as Henry Stimson, George Kennan, and Joseph Grew, the former ambassador to Japan. Some of the conservatives around MacArthur were rather disreputable, to put it mildly. General Willoughby, the aforementioned, his intelligence chief, was born in Germany as Adolf Karl Weidenbach, was an admirer of Mussolini. MacArthur called Willoughby, quote, my pet fascist, close quote. The intelligence chief, Willoughby, right, who arranged for the protection of Shiro Ishii from Unit 731, found allies among Japanese right-wingers, including some influential figures who had been arrested for war crimes and who sought to shape Japan according to their political wishes. This guy. Bass calls the New Dealers, quote, retributive and maximalist, close quote. That's a little unfair. They were convinced that there was enough Japanese enthusiasm for civic rights to establish a more liberal democracy than had existed before. And to a large degree, they were right. That Joseph Grew, George Kennan, Stimson, and Willoughby were skeptical of the prospects for such a liberal democracy was partly a matter of cultural or racial prejudice. In Stimson's view, the Japanese were, quote, an Oriental people with an Oriental mind and religion, close quote, and thus incapable of governing themselves. Attempts to democratize Japan, in his view, would end up making, quote, a hash of it, close quote. MacArthur himself, a martinet and a staunch Republican, was torn between his New Dealers and the conservatives. He compared the Japanese to, quote, a boy of 12, close quote, in terms of the, quote, standards of modern civilization, close quote. But he also had a rather grandiose idea of what he saw as his historic mission to establish a Christian democracy in Japan. This resulted in a liberal constitution, trade unions, land reforms, a free press, and women's suffrage, all of which were welcomed by most of the Japanese population. In the late 1940s, however, when the communists were winning in China and the Cold War was warming up, the right-wing, anti-communist views of people such as Willoughby gained strength. Reds in government jobs, trade unions, universities, and other institutions were purged. But almost all the men who had been indicted for war crimes were released as soon as the Tokyo trial was over. One of them was Nobusuke Kishi, the wartime vice minister of munitions and Shinzo Abe's grandfather, who escaped a prison sentence and became prime minister in 1957. In short, the kind of Japanese who objected to the Tokyo trial version of history soon returned to power with active American assistance, including large amounts of American cash that flowed into conservative coffers well into the 1960s. Some of the work of the New Dealers and the Japanese liberals was undone. There were no further efforts to hold the Japanese to account for waging aggressive wars and committing war crimes across Asia. Still, there was at least one aspect of the post-war Japanese constitution, written by American idealists, that could not be revised, and that was Article 9. Whereby Japan was to, quote, renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes, close quote, Article 9. This was simply too popular in Japan to touch. But the right-wing nationalists, and indeed many American conservatives such as Richard Nixon, deplored Article 9 as a big mistake. The nationalists continue to see Article 9 as a humiliating assault on Japanese sovereignty, while their liberal opponents continue to see pacifism as a necessary lesson to be drawn from Japan's dismal wartime record. As a result of this conflict, views on as a result of this, let me give you all that back. The nationalists continue to see Article 9 as a humiliating assault on Japanese sovereignty, while their liberal opponents continue to see pacifism as a necessary lesson to be drawn from Japan's dismal wartime record. As a result of this conflict, views on Japan's modern history have become hopelessly tangled up with post-war politics. The more liberals point to the Nanjing Massacre or the destruction of Japan itself as a warning not to change the Constitution, the more nationalists wish to deny that there was ever such a massacre in Nanjing or that Japan did anything to be particularly ashamed of. This has greatly muddled Japanese foreign policy, especially in Asia. Every time Japanese leaders issue formal apologies for Japan's dark past in other Asian countries, their efforts are undercut by right-wing politicians, making a show of visiting Yasukuni Shrine or insisting that school textbooks should be more patriotic and omit references to the Nanjing Massacre and other war crimes. This is embarrassing and makes it easier for China to stir up anti-Japanese sentiment. South Korea, given the increasing belligerence it faces from China, as well as from North Korea, should be a close ally of Japan's. But relations between the two countries remain troubled by Japanese right-wing denials that Korean women were forced to work in Japanese military brothels. Indeed, Japan's unresolved issues with the Tokyo trial version of history get to the heart of what Bass identifies as the country's greatest dilemma today. Japan's constitutional pacifism has always been predicated on the understanding that the U.S. would guarantee its security. Amid an increasingly hostile environment and an erratic American politics, Donald Trump, growing numbers of Japanese believe that a constitutional revision should now at least be seriously discussed, so that Japan can do more to defend itself and its neighbors. But neither Japan's allies in South Korea and Southeast Asia, nor its liberals at home, will be reassured by such a move, as long as the country's conservative leaders refuse to face up to its past and seek to appeal the verdict of history. I am MTK on the MIC. I apologize for the coughs and breaks. And that was from the October 23rd issue of The New Yorker, books section. All copyright to the owners. This is a non-monetized site, so no money is made here. No ads are here, purely for educational purposes. And the piece is by Ian Buruma, and it's called The Verdict. And it has been read here Sunday morning, the 18th of November, in Bangkok, Thailand, live by MTK on the MIC.